In this lecture, we want to look at the education theories that have come from the Middle Ages and expanded upon to right before the colonies were established, the pre-colonial days. And we need to see where our education has come from and founded, and where it's kind of divided away from the religious aspects that we'll see. One of the biggest things was Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, which were all Greek scholars, kind of are put off to the back burner when we get to 400 AD and then go beyond to about 1000 AD. That many people call it the Dark Ages. But from 400 AD to 1000, you see the founding of the Catholic Church. The Holy Roman Empire emerges, and Rome becomes Catholic as well. With that, we see a very heavy church doctrine emerge and a very heavy Eurocentric viewpoint. So the Greek scholars, which were discussing a soul and free will and items such as that, were kind of slid off to the back burner, and no one really talks about that because it's kind of hard to use Aristotle and his discussions of reason and discussions of how to be a good speech writer and apply that to modern day, at the time, theology. Well, we see that one of our first people, which is Thomas Aquinas, he emerges. If I can get this. Thomas Aquinas emerges as one of the great scholars of the early day. Now, Thomas Aquinas walks a fine line between church doctrine and Aristotle, and he does a great job with it. What Thomas Aquinas discusses is that you can have a religious belief that is also has an alignment with Aristotle's beliefs as well. Not only does he do that without being called a heretic, but he does that with and actually becomes a saint. A saint in the early Catholic Church was a holy person who was a normal human being that did great deeds on earth, and they call them saints. So he actually becomes a saint after he passes away. His most important aspect is that he actually applies Aristotle's theories and Aristotle's statements to modern day theology at the time. And one of the biggest questions he resolves is, how can people be atheist and still be full of wisdom? And what Thomas Aquinas says is there's two types of education. There's the moral realm, and then there's the reasoning realm. The reasoning realm would be just your thought and getting through processes. And then you have the moral, which is the God realm. So he actually says that there's kind of a division there. Just some images of Thomas Aquinas. One thing he talks about is he brings back the rebirth of Aristotle's theories. He talks about this soul versus the body. Now, soul is not something new because we saw soul whenever you look at the early theories of Plato. And you see that emerge a lot. But he says also the body is there too. There's an image, soul versus the body. Faith plus religion. Born in 1225, died at 49 years of age. And he said that you can explore the world through reason. And reason was a very important aspect of education. That you could use thought and get through a lot of elements that you don't understand. But he also said that we should gain knowledge through multiple sources. And this becomes one of the hallmarks that people love about Thomas Aquinas, or Aquinas, is this idea that you shouldn't just take one definitive statement and say that's the way it is. Now that kind of goes into a backlash against some religious beliefs of the Catholic Church at the time, but he actually counters that. If you ever read some of his more than 200 books he has, he actually counters that by proving God's existence in one of his books. And he says, by using reasoning, he says, you shouldn't just follow the Bible or the books that they had accumulated. He said you should also use reason. And that's one reason why the Catholic churches, and nowadays mainly the modern priests, priests today in the Catholic Church have to go through a seminary school. And when they do, they study a lot of the different books and the old books and the new books and all the old writings. And they really like Thomas Aquinas because Thomas Aquinas applies a lot of the church doctrine to the multiple sources that are contained through the libraries of the church. And that's why Thomas Aquinas is the patron saint, which they call patron, which means that's the person that's mostly related to your field, would be the patron saint of teachers, and he's also priest as well. So he said you should use multiple sources. He said there was 3 major elements that make someone a very good law-abiding person: prudence, justice, and fortitude. Prudence, justice, and fortitude. But he also said on a spiritual realm, which is the soul, there's also 3 different elements that we need to follow as well. And those are faith, hope, and charity. So you should use your brain and try to become a very good, faithful person full of hope and charity. Now, I was going to show a video on hope, but it turns out when I went to YouTube and typed in "what is hope," you will get 1,000 different videos. And I realized when I did that, there is a huge discussion on the definition of hope. What is hope? What is faith and what is charity? That is something that I never thought about. We kind of know what justice is, and prudence and fortitude and having good morals. But when we get into the spiritual realm of our soul and we say, well, what is faith? That kind of creates a level of reasoning that you're going to have to use and do a lot of thinking on. So I was going to do an assignment about what is hope, but that it would be a very lengthy assignment. And that was one thing that he asked. I'm going to show you a video about Thomas Aquinas at this time, which does a better job than what I've done. But you can also see through this video that Thomas Aquinas is a very complicated person who balanced the beliefs of the Catholic Church with the beliefs of Aristotle and kind of merged them together and created a very strong theology and also a very strong sense of questioning and understanding elements.
It seems at first weird that we might learn from Thomas Aquinas. He was a medieval saint who was reputed to have levitated and had visions of the Virgin Mary. He was much concerned with explaining how angels speak and move. And yet, he continues to matter because he helps us with a problem which continues to bedevil us: how we can reconcile religion with science and faith with reason. Aquinas was both a philosopher and a saint. Refusing either to lose his faith or mindlessly believe, he developed a new understanding of the place of reason in human life. Aquinas' monumental contribution was to teach Western European civilization that any human being, not just a Christian, could have access to great truths whenever they made use of God's greatest gift to human beings, reason. Aquinas broke a logjam in Christian thinking, the question of how non-Christians could have both wisdom and at the same time no interest in or even knowledge of Jesus. Aquinas universalized intelligence. He opened the Christian mind to the insights of all of humanity from across the ages and the continents. The modern world, insofar as it insists that good ideas can come from any quarter, regardless of creed or background, remains hugely in Aquinas' debt. Thomas Aquinas was born to a noble family in Italy in 1225. As a young man, he went to study at the University of Naples, and there came into contact with a source of knowledge which was just then being rediscovered: the texts of ancient Greek and Roman authors. Aquinas then became an academic at the University of Paris and an exceptionally prolific writer, producing nearly 200 pieces about Christian theology in less than 3 decades. His books bear beautiful and strange titles like the Summa Theologica and Summa Contra Gentiles. Such was his devotion to knowledge. Even at the moment of his death, at the age of 49, Aquinas is reputed to have been in the middle of writing an extended commentary on the Song of Songs. After he died, he was canonized in the Catholic Church and is now the patron saint of teachers. Aquinas' starting point was that some of the world's greatest thinkers have not been Christian, but this didn't bar them from having huge insights, because, as Aquinas proposed, the world can be usefully explored through reason and not just through faith. To explain how this could work, Aquinas brilliantly proposed that the universe and all its dynamics operate according to two kinds of law: secular natural law and religious eternal law. For Aquinas, a lot of the world follows natural laws. We can find out for ourselves how to smelt iron, build an aqueduct, or organize an economy, and none of this relies on believing in God. Aquinas discussed Jesus' injunction to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus may have given this idea a particularly memorable formulation, conceded Aquinas, but it's in fact been a cornerstone of moral principles in most societies at most times. How could this be possible? Well, the reason, Aquinas argued, is that it's an idea that belongs to natural and not eternal law. Aquinas conceded that in a few situations, God does work simply through eternal law outside of human reason, and he cited prophetic revelations and the visits of angels as examples. However, he reassured us that most useful knowledge can be found by atheists and secular-minded people within the realm of natural law. Aquinas' ideas unfolded at a time when Islamic culture was going through very similar dilemmas as Christianity in terms of how one can reconcile reason and faith. For a long time, the Islamic caliphates in Spain, Morocco, and Egypt had flourished by being open to knowledge from all over the world, generating a wealth of new scientific ideas and philosophy. However, due to the increasing influence of fanatical religious leaders, Islam had become more dogmatic and oppressive by the time Aquinas was born. It had, for example, reacted violently against the Muslim philosopher Averroes. Like Aquinas, Averroes had been deeply influenced by Aristotle and had argued that reason and religion could be compatible. However, the caliphates, anxious never to depart from the literal words of God, made sure that Averroes' ideas would be banned and his books burnt. Aquinas knew that the Muslim world's increasingly radical rejection of reason was harming what had once been its thriving intellectual culture, and it was overwhelmingly thanks to Aquinas' ideas that Christianity did not suffer the same process of stultification. Though Aquinas was a man of deep faith, he provided a philosophical framework for open scientific inquiry. He reminds us that knowledge can and should come from multiple sources, from intuition but also from rationality, from science but also from revelation, from pagans but also from monks. That sounds obvious until we notice just how often civilization has been and is still being harmed by people's refusal to take this brilliant idea on board.
So I really like the idea about Thomas Aquinas, or I'll pronounce it Aquinas, as this idea that we should use multiple sources, because sometimes we use one doctrine or one document and we say that's the law. We continue on with medieval universities and universities that have created. It really started with, once again, Socrates and Plato, and this idea that people would stand out in courtyards and do lectures and make statements, and they would also then start kind of asking for donations when they had very good speeches. So you had these roaming philosophers who would go from town to town and make these speeches. But with that said, you start seeing a need for a centralization of universities at the time. And one centralization occurs, and that's what we call is universities. Now, the Crusades occur, the Holy Crusades, and many people forget what that is. The Holy Crusades were an attempt by the Holy Roman Empire of the Catholic Church of taking back the Holy Land of Jerusalem from the Arabs. The Crusades were very pivotal because the Catholic Church had created a doctrine of making it a holy war or a crusade. And what that means is if according to church doctrine, if a holy war occurs and you fight in it and you die, then you go to heaven. So that's one reason why the Holy Crusades becomes a major push and becomes a huge thing. But one thing the Crusades did was it created a sharing of knowledge with so many people traveling from Italy and Rome to modern day Jerusalem. Then you see a sharing of scholars, and then books get taken over and they get stolen and they get moved around, and you really start seeing a lot of culture being changed. And that's one thing that we even see in the modern day today. That whenever, for example, if Delta Airlines announces that they're going to start providing services to a small little town that they haven't done before, you start seeing a sharing of culture there. You see museums pop up and stuff like that. So that's why a lot of countries try to they try to host major sporting events like the Olympics or the World Cup of Soccer, because that allows the world to see your culture and share your culture. Well, wars also do that as well. And this is one reason why universities start emerging. And we start seeing, for example, the University of Salerno, University of Paris emerges, Oxford University. We also see a lot of specialization of universities. There's law schools. There are schools of medicine. Medicine becomes a big element as well. And the universities emerge, Paris, Bologna. One of the biggest things, and I really like this, was the disputations of students. It kind of goes back to the idea of the early philosophers. And the idea is that whenever someone goes to college, they kind of sit back and they listen, and they learn, and they understand everything. And then they go into, at the end, a defense of a thesis, or a defense of something that you've learned and you have a belief in. And this is where we have our modern day defenses today in our major degree areas. Whenever you're going to get a major degree at a college, you have to do what's called a defense of your thesis. This goes back to these university days, which actually goes back before the universities, when you start seeing this idea of the public speaker scholar. And the idea is, if you ever seek your PhD or one of those high level degrees, you will have to present your written thesis, your huge paper, and you give it to them. And they've read it. And then you have a public oral defense where you stand up in front of a classroom and you defend what you've written to everyone, including anyone who just wants to walk in and listen to it. Not many people do, but that's the whole idea of this disputation, this idea that you are going to vet and discuss your belief in front of everyone. We do that today in conferences as well. In conferences, people will stand up and do speeches and presentations, and they're told to make sure they understand the material and understand the content. And from that, you would defend your dissertation as you can. I'm going to have a video now, which is going to show you the founding of Oxford and Cambridge University by this young guy who does a really good job with that.
To understand the founding of Oxford and Cambridge, we need to understand what universities were like and what universities were at the intersection of the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. In that period, the concept of a university was just evolving, and it was very different than what we think of as a university today. Before the first universities, people were either taught at monastic schools, typically based in rural monasteries, or by wandering scholars who would basically set up lectures and you would go to those lectures and learn something. It is this second method, the wandering scholar method, that really gave rise to what we consider a university today. And this method worked great until you begun to get large numbers of wandering scholars based in the same city. When you had maybe 10 or 20 wandering scholars all in one city, all competing with each other for students, you begun to run into problems. And things like guilds began to form amongst these wandering scholars and their students. These guildish university things were primarily meant to reduce competition amongst the professors and, more importantly, help protect the students and the professors from the local town. Now, while these new universities or proto-universities vastly reduce the amount of competition between these wandering scholars, they were still in a much more precarious position than today's university professors. For example, at the University of Bologna, one of the early universities, students would vote on how much they would pay their professors. And the professors weren't allowed to negotiate with the students. The professor had to leave the room and choose a student to negotiate their salary with the other students. And so that student would stand up and try and negotiate the highest price for them. But remember that they would also be paying the salary, so they wouldn't have a huge motivation to negotiate a great salary for this professor. It's important to note here as well that while there were internal factors, such as wanting to protect yourself from the local population and wanting to reduce competition that caused the creation of these early universities, there were also external factors. For example, the church did a lot to encourage their creation because it made it easier to monitor what was being taught in local towns. It's much easier to, tell a university you're teaching heretical stuff than it is to hunt down every one of the individual wandering scholars in a town and tell them you're teaching heretical stuff. The University of Oxford was founded as one of these proto-universities. That's why if you try and find a founding date for Oxford, they'll say, well, there is records of people teaching in the town of Oxford that go back as far as 1096. But it's hard to find an exact start date for the university because the change from a town where a lot of wandering scholars congregated to a actual university is sort of a fine line and a nebulous line. So the best we can say is, when were people first teaching in this town? All that said, Oxford really didn't reach critical mass to become what we might consider the beginnings of what it is today until Henry II banned English students from studying in France in the University of Paris, for obvious reasons, in 1167, which caused sort of a rapid expansion in the size of Oxford as a university. Now, before I can get into why Cambridge was founded as a university, it's important to understand how the university system helped protect students and professors from the towns themselves. Before these guild-like universities existed, when every student and professor was an individual actor, they made easy prey for unscrupulous townfolks. They were these rich dandies coming into town who didn't really understand the local dialect and may not even speak the local language. You could basically charge them whatever you wanted, or do any other number of abusive practices to them and get away with it because they were very much outsiders. When the students and wandering scholars banded together into these sort of early guild-like universities, they gained power over the town. Because unlike modern universities, they didn't own buildings, they would rent space. They didn't own dorms, they would rent space. And if a town ever really became abusive or the local civil authorities didn't do what this new guild-like university wanted them to do, they could just pick up and move to another town, which would really damage the local economy, especially once these student bodies began to bring in significant income to the local economy. So now, universities had the upper hand in the town and university conflict. But the deck was about to be stacked overwhelmingly in their favor. When the church got involved in wanting to encourage setting up these universities so that they could better monitor what was being taught, students became officially clerics, which meant students were tried in clerical courts and not civil courts. Clerical courts were the courts where deacons and bishops and priests were tried. Now, what makes students different from all these other people who are tried in clerical courts? Well, students could fornicate, and students could drink, and students were, well, college students. And now all of a sudden, they're being tried in courts that don't have, the death penalty, that aren't chopping off their hands in retribution for things, and that are of their dandy peers, not the local population. All of a sudden, the local population could no longer really try and punish students for their wrongdoing And even worse than that, now students are considered clerics, which means that if you were to fight back against a student, suppose a student was to walk up to you and begin pushing you, really drunk, like, hey, what's up, mate? If you hit them back, you could be excommunicated. And as you can imagine, this led to rather abusive behavior on behalf of the students towards the town folks. They now could not be punished back, and they held the town's purse strings. As you can imagine, this was a societal powder keg. Town-gown relations were at a historic all-time low throughout the High Middle Ages. And this powder keg would erupt frequently, and you'd get fallout, and the university would leave. But in one particularly noticeable example for our story, in Oxford, a couple students murdered a woman. Now, if they had been tried in the clerical court like they were supposed to be tried, they couldn't have gotten the death penalty. And the town was not really okay with this. Basically, they'd had enough of being pushed around, and they tried them in the civil courts, and they were hung. And the university was very upset. And so the university, like they had done in the past, went on strike. They went to other cities to begin setting up their teaching. Some went to the University of Paris. Some set up a small teaching thing in reading. And the majority went to a town called Cambridge. To the individuals doing this, this was a typical strike. This was something universities throughout the High Middle Ages did. But when we look back on it from a historic perspective, we say this is the founding of the University of Cambridge. And in a way it was. They would have immediately started calling themselves the University of Cambridge because in the High Middle Ages, universities were always named after the city they were based in. Whether it's the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Edinburgh, you would always name the university after the town it was based in, so they would have immediately started calling themselves the University of Cambridge. But they would not have seen themselves as being a different organization than the university that used to be set up in Oxford. Now, I couldn't find out why this happened, but in this particular instance, this particular one instance in the High Middle Ages, the university never went off strike, or at least a large portion of the university never went off strike, and I also can't find out how large a portion of the university never went off strike. But when it was time to return to Oxford, a number of students and professors decided they didn't want to. And I can't find out whether it was a majority or just a few, but enough of them decided to stay in Cambridge that you had the beginnings of the University of Cambridge. While the rest went back to Oxford and continued with the tradition of the University of Oxford. Now, Cambridge was really solidified as a separate institution when it got its charter from the Crown in 1231. Oxford didn't get its charter until 1248, and so many individuals from Cambridge will use this to say that Cambridge was founded before Oxford and is the older university. When in reality, to say that either Cambridge or Oxford is the older university is sort of a pointless claim. They were both really founded as the same university, which split into two universities. But have traditions that are equally old and stem from this one tradition in the High Middle Ages. As always, the links are...
He actually does a pretty good job talking about universities, but I like his video not because it goes beyond Cambridge and Oxford. He also talks about how the first universities were created and founded. So I like that idea. The Arab scholars, we really can't pass a chance to talk about the Arab scholars. The Arab scholars were located where modern day Saudi Arabia is, Israel, Egypt, that area, Morocco, North Africa. We see that they're actually doing some really great things at this time. And one thing that they do, which is just amazing, is they take a lot of the Greek text and translate them into Arabic. Sorry about that. So the reason they do that is they're just fanatics with copying stuff. And because they did that, and with the Crusades coming in, and also just people steal and lose books, some of the Greek books were lost, and lost forever. And because the Arabs translated those, we actually kept those. But beyond that, a lot of great, smart Arab scholars emerge, and they do a lot of important things and also write their own books. And one of these scholars, which if I can get this to click, is Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, and he actually created algebra, modern day algebra. We actually have that. So mathematics starts coming from here. I have a video for this next guy, Avicenna. He actually produces medicine, but what he does is he doesn't really produce medicine. He produces the most comprehensive book on medicine, an index file. And he takes all of the modern day medicine at the time, of course, and creates what we know about medicine and writes a comprehensive book. Now, with that said, if you look at the book today, a lot of that stuff that you're like, man, I can't believe they did that. For example, they did a lot of bloodletting, a lot of bleeding of people. But his book also shows the concept at the time of the human body and how circulation and diseases worked. But more importantly, his book was one of the greatest books because it shows a comprehensive of all the stuff at that one time, like an index fund. So that was really good about that. The next one you don't really hear much about at all, Averroes. Averroes was kind of like the Thomas Aquinas of the Arab world. He applied Aristotle's thinking to the Quran and the belief of the Muslims at the time. And because there was a lot of conflict with that, his books were ordered to be burned. So you really don't see much of his scholarly work because of that. I was always amazed by that. I'm going to show you a video on the Arab scholars at this time.
Looking back at medieval Islamic medicine with modern scientific eyes is frustrating. They take as true many things we know to be nonsense. But on the other hand, their desire to deal with this vast subject logically and systematically is admirable and truly marks a break with the past. One Islamic scholar, more than any other, embodies the synthesis of religion, faith, and reason. His name was Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he's known in the West. He was a polymath who clearly thrived in intellectual and courtly circles. In 1025, he completed this, Al-Qanun fil Tib, or the Canon of Medicine. In it, Ibn Sina collated and expanded on all that had gone before him, medical ideas from Greece to India, and turned them into a single work. So how would you place this book in a historical context?
Oh, it's hugely important. I mean, there are a few books which are as important as the canon because what this encyclopedia does, it kind of, sweeps away everything else. It becomes a textbook. It supersedes a lot of other texts, and people even complain that, it's so good, it's so tightly organized, it's so easily accessible that people forget to read the Greek sources in Arabic translations. This whole first book, this is the first book, contains what we call the kulliyat, the general principles. So it's all about how the human body works, how diseases work in general. The second book contains diseases, what we sometimes call from tip to toe, like from tip to toe. So he starts with the diseases of the head, and then he moves down, like the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth. And normally they end up at the sexual organs, you see.
At first sight, the sheer ambition of the 3 volumes is hugely impressive. Here's an attempt at diagnosis and cure for diseases as diverse as depression, meningitis, and smallpox. And there's even detailed chapters on more common problems.
So, like for instance, here you have like headaches.
So different kinds of headaches.
في العلاج الصداع الحادث عن الروائح الطيبة. So headaches caused by pleasant, fragrant smells.
And then he's also got الحادث من الخمار, so hangovers.
Different kinds of jima. You can get headache from sex.
Is that right?
Well, I mean, hasn't happened to me yet, but I mean, let's see. So, the treatment of headache caused by sex. ويجب لمن يعتريه ذلك عقب الجماع وَبِي إِمْتِلَاءٌ أَنْ يَبْدَأُ بِالْفَاسْتِ. So if somebody has or is befallen by, suffers from a headache after sex, and he also has a repletion, so he has too many superfluities or something like that, so yajibu an yabda'a bil fast. One has to first resort to venesection or bloodletting. Thumma bil ishal, and then you should use purging. In wajaba kullu wahidin minhuma. For both of them, I mean, like bloodletting and purging are necessary.
A lot of the stuff in here sounds like nonsense, of course,
Oh.
because this is not modern medicine.
No, it's not.
So how long was this taken seriously?
Well, the fundamental ideas contained here about how the body works, I mean, they hadn't changed until the early 19th century. I mean, there was progress, obviously, on certain levels, but the essence was the same. And then came the big break with the discovery of bacteria and viruses and things like that. And from the second half of the 19th century onwards, medicine was totally revolutionized.
Ibn Sina's canon of medicine is a landmark in the history of the subject. Although much of the medical science it espouses we know now to be terribly misguided, its value lies in accumulating the best knowledge in the world at the time into one accessible, organized text. The canon would give future generations something to rewrite.
So now we start seeing the emergence of what's called the Renaissance era. So we have a lot of scholars and we have a lot of ideas that are floating around. But now we get what's called the rebirth. We all know that term because it comes from our history classes when we were students. Renaissance means rebirth. But what is a rebirth of? Well, now we know what a rebirth is. It's a rebirth of the classical scholars. Because there's a belief that we need to look back to the past to know where we're going. And we look back to the Greeks and the Romans. And that's what they did. That's what all of Europe did, was they looked back to the Greeks and the Romans. The Romans liked to use trade. The Greeks liked to use poetry and art. But they also had Alexander the Great. So they liked war. So they also liked the nationalism, the idea of the Spartans, the ideas of the Athenians. So with the Renaissance, we see this growth of what's called dehumanism. And I'll show you a video on humanism, but first let me describe what that means. This idea of humanism is this idea of nationalism, of being proud of your country, but also being this idea that the human nature is the subject, the dignity of the individual, free will, and the value of the human spirit and all nature. The value of the human spirit all the time is very important. The humanists considered the educated of the man to be the secular man of learning described in the classics. They also looked towards scholars such as Quintilian. Now you may think, well, how did they find the Greek scholar Quintilian? And the reason they found it was, what I mentioned earlier, was when Constantinople fell during the Crusades, they actually found some Arab writing in about Quintilian. So that shows you once again, so he starts emerging in there as well. And one thing that they talked about, the Greeks did, was talk about art and writing and elements such as that. And this idea of using religion was also a big component of it, but also using picture books. And one thing that we see is with Quintilian, the rise of free will, freedom of spirit, and look at the classics. But this becomes one of the most pivotal books that we start seeing emerge. It's called the New England Primer, or Primer, as they pronounce it. I always pronounce it. I'm Southern, so I say Primer. The New England Primer was a book that they used for young students. And this came around the idea of the Renaissance era, where it used art and songs and words to teach, and then they brought in religion also to teach religious elements. So they would say, for example, A is for apple. Apple is what Adam ate in the Garden of Eden. See, they would do that. They would use the New England Primer as a source of pictures, as a source of teach letters and books, but also to teach religion as well. So why am I mentioning the New England Primer? The New England Primer also shows us the need for what's becoming emerging is the printing press, which also comes during this time. The printing press really starts producing elements where you can mass produce books and bring out ideas. And with the New England Primer, or however you want to pronounce it, that starts emerging through. We see later on, when we talk in another lecture about the founding of the colonies, we see this book is brought along with it too. So the book of the Renaissance starts emerging into modern day American society. So I'm going to show you a video on what is the humanist at this time.
Hi, my name is Paul Sargent. Welcome once again to AP Euro Bit by Bit, in which I'm taking modern European history and breaking it down into small pieces so that you can better understand it. Today's question, what was humanism? Let's take a look. So to begin with, humanism was an intellectual movement. That's why there's an ism on the end. Those three letters signify a belief in something, and throughout European history we were overloaded with isms. Why? Well, Europe is a land of ideas and action. Generally speaking, ideas are formulated before actions are taken, and that's going to be a constant theme throughout the modern age. So humanism, or Renaissance humanism as it's also referred to, was the renewed belief in the value and power of the individual. Throughout the Middle Ages, the general concept of man's place in the universe was one of obedience. People were expected to live their lives to worship God, and they were asked by the church to earn their way into heaven by following the sacraments and through good works. In the 14th century, intellectuals began to question this purely religious view of life on earth. They studied the classical languages of Greek and Latin in order to read the wisdom of writers from the ancient world. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, many of those ancient texts and the scholars who kept them made their way to Italy, which reintroduced a treasure trove of writings to Western Europe. So suddenly, the ideas of ancient writers become available to a whole new audience. Ancient values such as civic virtue became subjects of conversation. And as more people started reading these texts, the demand for lay education, for schools run outside the realm of monastic communities and outside of the church, well, that increased. Wealthy families began to support the schools and send their children to the schools to learn Greek and Latin and gain access to ancient ideas. The problem was that some of those ideas came into conflict with the teaching and doctrine of the Catholic Church. Humanism had at its core the belief in two things: individualism and secularism. That is, a departure from religion. However, it's important to understand that humanists didn't really reject Catholicism, and they didn't reject religion. What they wanted to do is they wanted to take the ideas of the ancients and use education to better understand the world while still retaining their Catholic beliefs. Now, maybe what I said just doesn't make sense, but if you bear with me, I think it'll all kind of come together. What we need to do now that we understand what humanism is to take a look at four of the most influential humanist thinkers. Petrarch is generally regarded as the father of the Renaissance. Writing in the 14th century, he was the first guy who looked at the Middle Ages as a period of darkness and promoted the belief that medieval culture was ignorant of classical ideals. He was totally wrong about this, and every medieval scholar today can come up with a long list of reasons why he was wrong. But Petrarch understood that new movements need to set themselves apart from the current society, so he might have overstated things a little bit. He scoured the monasteries of Europe for ancient texts and promoted the study of classical Latin. We're talking about the time of Julius Caesar, that sort of period. He also promoted the use of something called the vernacular. Those are the spoken languages throughout Europe. In his case, it was Italian. He promoted these in writing instead of the medieval Latin that monks and church scholars were using at the time. By the 15th century, writers began identifying themselves as humanist. Lorenzo Valla from Rome dedicated his adult life to use his humanist education to help the church. He even tried to get the job of papal secretary, but was unsuccessful. So he set off around Europe intensely studying Greek and Latin, finding every text he possibly could. And he pushed the concept that classical Latin, especially that of about the 200 years surrounding the birth of Christ, as being the purest, most beautiful form of Latin in history. Now, we all know that languages change over time, and he wanted to restore Latin to its rightful position over the vernacular. Now, Vala's deep understanding of Latin and its development over time led to some trouble. His studies brought to his attention a thing called the Donation of Constantine. This is a document in which the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century gave vast amounts of land to the Catholic Church. Now, what Vala found was that the Latin used in the document didn't match the Latin being used during Constantine's time, but it was actually a form of language being used around 400 years later. In other words, he proved through linguistic analysis that the document was a fraud. Now, that didn't make his beloved Catholic Church happy, but ironically, after many years of criticism, he was named papal secretary in 1447, proving that humanism had won over tradition and orthodoxy. In the later 15th century, scholarly interest in the works of Plato surged, and the major figure in promoting Plato was the Florentine writer Marsilio Ficino. Under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, Ficino created and promoted the movement known as Neoplatonism. Neo, you may know, means new. So whenever you encounter movements whose name starts with neo, understand that means a revival of an old idea. But anyway, so Ficino's Neoplatonism attempted to take Plato's ideas and join them with Catholicism. And it had two major components. The world was organized hierarchically, with plants at the bottom and God at the top. Man was in the middle, and man represented the link between the material realm and the spiritual realm. All right, second, he had this theory of Platonic love, and it held that just as all people are connected in their humanity through love, so too all parts of the universe are connected through love. Okay, so that's 3 writers, just one more to go. By the late 15th century, humanism had been developing for almost 100 years. It was then that Pico della Mirandola wrote one of the most famous humanist pieces of all time. It was titled Oration on the Dignity of Man, and in it, Mirandola combined nuggets of what he called universal truth from many writers to come up with God's message to all of mankind. He believed that God had created unlimited potential in people, or as he put it, to him it is granted to have whatever he chooses, to be whatever he wills. In other words, God gave us all the potential to become whatever we want. Mirandola had successfully achieved the goals of humanism. He had reconciled the pagan ideas of ancient writers with the revelations of Catholicism. But that didn't mean that humanism was finished. It would spread to Northern Europe and find new scholars with new ideas. More on that another time. So to review, humanism was the revival of interest in the classical ideals of Greece and Rome. And humanists used their education to translate the works of classical writers and use them to better understand the universe and man's place in it. Humanism gave us the foundation for most of modern Western thought. And so on that note, we've come to the end of the video. I hope that you've understood the concept of Renaissance humanism, and please subscribe so that you get notified whenever I post new videos. Thanks for watching AP Euro Bit by Bit. My name's Paul Sargent. Thanks for watching.
So with the Renaissance emerging, with the printing press, also now with gunpowder emerging, we have the idea of what's called the Reformation. Now the Reformation is one of the most critical times in all the education system between 1000 AD and of course 1600 AD. The Reformation is of course the break from the Catholic Church. It is done by several people at this time. It wasn't just one person. We always get this idea that it was Martin Luther, nailing his 95 Thesis on the wall. But it's really beyond that. You have to look at, now we've already laid the seed to this, and that is you have the printing press, you have the Crusades ending, you have a lot of people saying, what was that war over? What happened there? You have all these scholars emerging. The humanists start popping up, this idea of let's look to the past, let's look at free will, let's look at all these elements. And then you start saying, well, what are we doing in our life? We only live for so long, and we need to look at what's going on with this church. And then you have also, combined with that, a corrupt church system where there are selling bribes and items such as that. And this creates a perfect example and a perfect time for a breakaway that occurs. And that is known as the Reformation, or really the reform of the church. So if you look back beyond, you have the Jews, and then you have what's known as the Christian movement, which emerges after the death of Jesus Christ. From the Christianity movement, there was other churches as well, but the dominant church that emerges is the Catholic Church. And that really has a major monopoly on the Christian faith all the way up to the Reformation. Once the Reformation occurs, there are hundreds of faiths that emerge from this. Hundreds of Christian faiths that also emerge. There are people who actually create churches to try to get back to the way it was. So all these elements emerge, and this creates just for education-wise, a thriving education system. And the reason is this. When you have this many people believing in different beliefs that are just kind of different compared to other religions, you're this Christian and you're this Christian sect, then you start seeing publications and books start emerging with the printing press more, and then people start trying to change the curriculum and education system. So the Renaissance, combined with the Reformation, creates this huge education system that we will see trickle into, and not only trickle, but flood into our colonies when the French get there, when the English get there, when the Spanish get there. And the Puritans also come in there, and they start creating their own education systems. And they start creating, what do we want with this? And that's why the colonies, modern day United States of America, has a time to create a wonderful education system. And we'll see how they kind of hit and miss on some of those elements. And we're still trying to fix that, of course. And you'll see how all that works. So I have a very long video, but it is a great video, and I'm borrowing it from these guys. This guy on the internet who has like 2 million views. But I want you to watch this because he does a great job. Crash course on Reformation, and I'll put this right here.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about the Protestant Reformation. Mr. Green, this is irrelevant for me. I'm an atheist. Yeah, I know me from the past because I'm you. Although, actually, you are now Episcopalian, a Protestant church started because a king wanted to get a divorce. But anyway, let me submit that religious history is important regardless of your personal religious beliefs because it helps us to understand the lenses through which people have viewed their lives and communities. And given that, the Protestant Reformation is what proper historians refer to as a big-ass deal, which I will remind you is not cursing if you are referring to donkeys. So before the Reformation, pretty much all Christians in Europe were Roman Catholic. Yes, there were other types of Christians in Eastern Europe and Asia and Africa, but Roman Catholicism was the dominant form of Christianity and had been since like the 4th century. The Protestant Reformation broke so-called Western Christendom into 2 and then 3 and then 4 until finally there were uncountable denominations of Christianity. Not just Lutherans, but Apostolic Lutherans and Reformed Lutherans and Free Lutherans and Lutherans for just going back to being Catholic because this has become so complicated. This was hugely important. It changed people's way of looking at themselves and the world. It led to wider European literacy and eventually forced governments to grant religious freedoms while also at the same time maybe being more of a political revolution than a religious one. So during the European Middle Ages, the Catholic Church really dominated European civilization. It's almost impossible to imagine the scope of the Church's power in the Middle Ages, but let's try. First off, the Catholic Church was the caretaker of the most important thing that Christians had, their souls, which unlike our temporal bodies were eternal. And then there was the parish priest, who played a pivotal role throughout every person's life, baptizing them, marrying them, hearing their confessions, providing last rites. The church also provided all of the social services. It distributed alms to the poor and ran orphanages and provided what education was available. And most Europeans would in their lives meet exactly one person who could read the Bible, which was only available in Latin: their parish priest. And the church owned over 1/3 of all the land in Europe, which helped make it the most powerful economic and political force on the continent. And the Pope claimed authority over all the kings of Europe as the successor to the Roman emperor. So this was a very powerful institution, and it was undone by one chronically constipated monk. Here at Crash Course, we don't like to get too into like great man history, but the Reformation really was initiated and shaped by one man, Martin Luther. No, Stan, the Martin Luther he was named for. No, Stan, the Martin Luther that he was named for, yes. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Luther studied law, and like most law students, he hated it. Then one day, a sudden storm blew up, lightning struck him to the ground, and in a panic, he cried, "Help me, Saint Anne, I'll become a monk." He survived, and in the next 2 weeks, he withdrew from university, entered an Augustinian monastery, took his vows, and sent a message to inform his family, who I'm sure were delighted to have spent all that money on education because monking is so lucrative. In 1505, Luther was sent to Rome on a diplomatic mission, and he ignored all the awesome art and focused instead on Rome's corruption, with prostitutes openly soliciting on the filthy streets, priests who made light of their duties, hurrying through Mass so fast that it seemed to mean nothing, and openly deriding church doctrine. Luther was obsessed with his own sinfulness, and he kept confessing incessantly, and finally his confessor and teachers sent him to the University of Wittenberg because, they were a little bit annoyed with him, and they figured he'd be good at teaching scripture. These days, of course, incessant confessors are put on the Real Housewives of New Jersey, but back then you sent them to the University of Wittenberg. Anyway, Luther finally found his answer in St. Paul's epistles, specifically in one line that said, "The just shall live by faith." In other words, salvation comes through faith, not good works, not through prayer or fasting or vigils or pilgrimages or relics or giving to the poor or the sacraments or any action that a person can take. We can't ever be good enough through our actions to merit salvation. We can only have faith. In Latin, sola fide. Only faith. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Martin Luther's new interpretation of sola fide grew into a full-scale conflict with the Catholic Church when a friar named John Tetzel came to Wittenberg selling indulgences. An indulgence was a donation to the church that came with a promise from the Pope to reduce a sinner's time in purgatory. Like, to quote from an indulgence that Friar Tetzel sold, "I replace thee in the state of innocence and purity in which thou wert at the hour of thy baptism." Luther felt like that wasn't the sort of thing that, should be for sale. The price of this whole life complete forgiveness of any horrible sin certificate, by the way, was 3 marks, probably about half a year's wages for a laborer. So Luther didn't like seeing his parishioners handing over money that they didn't have for a scrap of paper that he believed to be meaningless. So in response, he wrote 95 theses against indulgences and then dramatically nailed them to the church door for all to see on October 31st, 1517, or else he mailed them to the archbishop, or possibly both. We don't actually know. This led to a series of debates with other men of the cloth, during which Luther's positions became increasingly radical. Starting from the statement that Christians were saved only through faith and the grace of God, for instance, Luther then upped the ante, saying that the church's rituals didn't have the power to save souls. And then he argued that far from being infallible, the church and the Pope made errors all the time. That was a pretty bold thing to say, and then it got even more dramatic when Luther ultimately denied that the church and the officers of it had any spiritual powers. He said that the priesthood was a human invention and that individual Christians didn't even need priests to receive the grace of God. Instead, Luther described a priesthood of all believers. So this had gone from a call for reforming indulgences to a revolution. So in 1521, Luther was called to defend his ideas before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the imperial diet of Worms, or in German, Worms. Also, let me say retroactively, now that everyone has commented on my poor German pronunciation, Wittenberg. Emperor Charles famously said, "A single friar who goes counter to all Christianity for 1,000 years must be wrong." To which Luther was like, "Stop flapping that hideous Habsburg jaw of yours." But there was something to what Charles was saying, right? Because plenty of radical friars had criticized the church's abuses and hypocrisies over the years. Why would Luther prove influential? Well, one reason was the printing press. Now, most people in Europe at the time couldn't read, but a lot of people could, including, of course, a lot of priests, and over 2,000 editions of Luther's writings appeared between 1517 and 1526. And his ideas also appeared in pamphlets and posters and cartoons that were seen and read aloud, reaching millions of readers and listeners. In short, Luther's ideas were all over like the Tumblr of the day, which was a town crier and broadsides nailed to doors. And it caused quite a stir, especially the stuff about like the Pope being the Antichrist sent by the devil. Like I said, it got pretty radical. But maybe the most revolutionary of Luther's publications was his new translation of the Bible into German. For the first time ever, non-priests could read the Bible for themselves because Luther used the German that people actually spoke instead of Latin, and his work quickly caught on among common people. Hundreds of thousands of copies of of Luther's Bible were printed, people carried it in their pockets and memorized it. Now everyone could quote scripture and discuss its meaning. Now Luther's theory was that if everyone just returned directly to the scriptures, they would see the one single truth, and the church would be restored to its original simplicity. Yeah, no, I have a message to the restorers of history. There is no original simplicity! The thing is, once you start making scripture accessible to everyone and tell them that their opinions are just as good as those of the clergy, what happens is that people start, having different interpretations of what religious truth is. So Luther's protest started creating spin-offs, the Zwinglians and the Calvinists and the Anabaptists, and then the spin-offs had their own spin-offs. It's like how first there was Iron Man, and then there was the Avengers, and then, like an Avengers TV show. Pretty soon we're gonna have Ant-Man get his own movie. The Protestant Reformation is basically just the exact same thing as the Marvel comic universe, but no Thor because he's pagan. Anyway, many of these new denominations will be familiar to you. The Anglicans and Puritans, the Quakers, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists. Each of these new Protestant churches thought that it knew the one true way to worship God, and that, everyone else was going to hell, and this led to some fighting. And also some disemboweling. Oh, it's time for the open letter. But first, let's see what's in the Globe today. Oh, that's nice. I thought it would be disemboweled people, but it's Anabaptists not baptizing their infants. Hi there. So you don't believe in infant baptism. You believe that, people should come of age so that they can make their own decision about salvation. Other people, Catholics, many Protestants, believe that it's okay to baptize infants, or even that it's good. I don't feel like this disagreement should lead to disembowelment, and yet it did. The fascinating thing to me, Anabaptists, is that you never had a state, you never had widespread political say in any community, and yet your brand of evangelical Christianity managed to become incredibly important in world history. In short, the bad news is that many of you are going to be executed. The good news is that your message will prove surprisingly resilient. Stan, who did I even make that open letter for? The Anabaptists are Amish now. They're not watching this. I guess some of them are Mennonites. I made it for you, Mennonites! Okay, so with all these new denominations, there were years of religious mayhem. Clergy preached radical new ideas, and then other people interpreted them in even more radical ways. People, especially young people, smashed up churches because the Bible says no graven images. What started as a doctrinal dispute turned into a social revolt, and in 1525 German peasants took up Luther's ideas to give voice to long-standing grievances against landlords and clergymen. In their most famous revolutionary proclamation, the 12 Articles, the peasants echoed Luther's language, proclaiming that serfdom was invented by men with no basis in scripture. The peasants rebelled, refused to pay taxes, pillaged church lands, and raised an army estimated at 300,000 people. And Luther was like, yes! Free souls, sovereign at last! No, just kidding, he wasn't. Luther chose the elite and said that Christian liberty was a spiritual concept, not meant to promote equality or freedom in, the physical world. He then urged the faithful to smite, slay, and stab rebels and kill them like mad dogs. He also gave up his idea that congregations should elect their own ministers and argued that kings and princes were put in place by God as caretakers of the church. And that turned out to be the winning side. For a few hundred years anyway. The German Peasants' Revolt, the biggest revolutionary uprising in Europe before the French Revolution, was suppressed with crushing brutality. An estimated 100,000 people were killed. So Luther chose the princes in the name of stability and success, but why would princes choose Lutheranism when the Holy Roman Emperor had forbidden it? Let's look at one example, the first actual ruler who broke with the Pope, the heroic, frequently divorced founder of Anglicanism, King Henry VIII of England. What's that, Stan? Apparently it was not King Henry VIII. It was Grand Master Albert of the Teutonic Order of Monks, crusaders who'd come to rule parts of what is now Poland. So many Teutonic knights individually left the order for Lutheranism because they liked the theology. Albert started by reading Lutheran tracts, and he became a fan, allowing Lutheran preachers into his cities and even traveling to meet with Luther in person. On Luther's advice, Grand Master Albert dissolved the Teutonic state and founded instead the Duchy of Prussia. I guess that was a country where they all danced the Dougie? Oh, it's the Duchy of Prussia. Stan informs me that it is neither the Duchy nor the Duchy of Prussia, but the Duchy of Prussia. Anyway, Albert established a Lutheran church there, the first Lutheran state church. But it's unlikely that Albert was really motivated by a desire to purge the church of corruption. I mean, at the time of his decision, the Grand Master had been in trouble. He was losing territorial battles against the rest of Poland, and he was running out of money. By breaking with the church, Albert was able to seize the church assets within his territory, which bolstered his military might and then allowed him to settle his war favorably. In another major plus, now that he was a duke instead of a Grand Master monk, he could get married and produce heirs, which he did, founding the House of Hohenzollern, destined to unify and rule the German Empire a few centuries later. And this points to a huge incentive for princes and kings to break with the Pope. What if instead of the church having all of that money and power, I could have it? Those are like the two favorite things of monarchs, and Protestantism allowed them to confiscate church land and other wealth, collect church taxes, and use church land for themselves. Why is the Queen the largest landowner in England? Because the Protestant Reformation. That said, we shouldn't minimize the extent to which the Reformation really was about belief. I mean, Catholics truly believed that Protestants were heretics, and Protestants truly believed that the Pope and his hierarchy were impostors. If it were only about land and influence, how could we explain the case of Saxon Elector John Frederick, for instance? When defeated and imprisoned by his Catholic emperor, Frederick was given the choice between his lands and his faith. He chose his faith. And then there were Catholics like Sir Thomas More, who would not sanction Henry VIII's break with the Pope and chose execution over sacrilege. So in the end, the Reformation was both a religious movement and a political one. Now, many argue that the Reformation eventually led to more religious toleration in Europe because people just had to learn to live with each other once they had a bunch of wars and figured out that there were going to be both Catholic and Protestants moving forward. There were many other effects of the Protestant Reformation. Max Weber famously called it the foundation of European capitalism. But for me, the most crucial aspect of the Protestant Reformation is contained inside the words protest and reform. These have become two of the central political ideas in recent centuries. And while religion has justifiably been blamed for much violence and intolerance, we should also remember that many of the leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement, for instance, were Protestant clergy. And they saw a history of protest that could fuel real and lasting reform that included people like Gandhi and Thoreau, but also people like Martin Luther. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is filmed here in...
This is just a great video on Reformation. He talks very fast, but he does a great job. And he taught more than I could ever teach you on the Reformation. So why reinvent the wheel, obviously. With this, we have John Calvin emerge and Martin Luther. But now we kind of see where the scene is being set. The scene for the colonies, for everyone to leave England and leave France and leave Spain and start coming over to America. And once they get to this new land that's already been discovered, the Native Americans are already there, they start creating these new Spains, new France, and new England, and they start creating their own education system. So we get to see how that's going to be developed. And we also get to see how religion it brings into that. We'll look at that next time. Well, another big element that we start seeing, and this is the element that will really just change our education system, is who's going to pay for this? You know, in the European days, the educations were church-oriented, and the church or the government paid for that. But now we're going to look at a big element, and that is who pays for public education. And we start seeing that discussion when we get to the colonies, and we start seeing the need for public schools. And when you have public schools, you start saying, well, we need to also have freedoms. And then they start trying to take the religion out of that. And we'll see how that's going to play out in the colonies and then finally the states when we look at that. And then we start seeing a need for American education, secondary system, and then the colleges systems. So just this week, I wanted to just give you, I've really never looked at this period in education. I've talked about, I've really looked at the 20th century and the founding of the African American schools and the social study movements that emerged there. And I've looked at Plato and Socrates before, but I really never looked at the middle. And there's so much out there. But when you look at Thomas Aquinas and you look at the Arabs who brought in their education system, the humanists, the Renaissance era, the Reformation era, and you see all of this stimulation of learning and where we're wanting to go, but you also see this factor of religion on there. But you also see, where does religion factor into our education system? And how does all that play out? And then that really sets the stage for how our education system is founded. So I just wanted to kind of enlighten you on this period, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you for listening.